I am often quite critical of the GNOME project and choices made within. But it's one thing if a choice is made and it only affects users on GNOME. Yes, it's annoying they want to move away from application icons, so if you run an application under GNOME that relies on certain icons, it's probably gonna look wrong. Yes, it's annoying they don't support server-side decorations, leading to tons of applications basically being broken or having to go and implement a workaround specifically for just GNOME. But these don't really matter, and you can just say, well, GNOME's going to be a broken desktop, I'm just not going to support it properly. But where this becomes a real problem is when a choice made affects applications and affects desktops and affects developers outside of GNOME. And in many ways, the case of DRM leasing exactly fits this bill. By actively disregarding this protocol for so long, VR development on Linux has been held back. So much so that Valve's own SteamVR documentation for getting VR working under Linux specifically recommends if you are running GNOME Wayland, just run the X11 version or uninstall it and install KDE Plasma instead. However, I have to be fair and give GNOME props when they're due. This video, when it was originally planned, was going to be about how the protocol got stalled, how some GNOME developers wanted to go down this weird route that was never going to be adopted and was just a giant waste of everybody's time instead of working on the protocol that was agreed upon. But this has turned into a story of redemption. That's because GNOME finally, and I'm genuinely impressed this ever happened, Add Wayland DRM Lease protocol support has been merged and is probably going to be shipping in GNOME 47. So by now, you know the drill. Let's see how we got here. Now, DRM leasing is a long-resolved Wayland discussion. It did take a while to work through, but everything got dealt with way back in 2021. So the merge request was opened by Xavier Hugel, DRM Lease protocol support. Now, technically, it does go back a little bit further than this, initially being started in 2019 by Marius Vlad and Drew DeVault, who Drew DeVault at the time was working on WL Roots and the Sway project, but I want to focus on the merge request because this is the kind of main important part. The primary use case for this is virtual reality headsets, which via the non-desktop DRM property are generally not used as desktop displays by Wayland compositors, and for latency reasons among others, are most useful to games et al. If they have direct control over the DRM resources associated with it. DRM, as always, means Direct Rendering Manager. Basically, these are peripherals which are of no use to the compositor and may be of use to a client, but since they're tied up in DRM, we need to use DRM leasing to get them into the client's hands. The TLDR is basically, it allows you to draw to the VR headset without needing to go through the compositing of the desktop, which adds additional latency, which does not need to be there if you're trying to play a VR game, for example. Now, yes, as tended to happen, especially more so back then, this was basically a 3-year protocol discussion. Things back then did get stalled quite a bit more often. There was less, I guess, stress and desire to get things resolved quickly, so sometimes they took way longer than they should have. But by the time that this was happening, and by the time that everything got merged, things were coming along really, really well. We got a lot of pieces in place. So this here is a merge request from WL Root. Here is from Plasma. This was also made by Xavier Hugel. Here is on X Wayland. Here is one in Vulkan. And here is one in Mesa. Basically, all of the pieces fit into place. Within a couple of months of this protocol being opened, everything was ready. With Simon Sir, who is now the guy who runs WL Roots and Sway, saying at the end, big thanks to everyone involved on working on this extension. However, looking at this list, there is one notable missing project. That project being GNOME. Now, at this point, that's totally okay, right? Like, this is just being worked on, things are not merged yet, and as you look through here, you're going to notice a very common name showing up. That being, right here, Jonas Adal. This is one of GNOME's voting members for Wayland, and they were quite active in getting this dealt with. And finally, towards the end here, they said, just checked one last time, and I'm happy with the current state. I'm not finished with an implementation in Mutter yet, but given it has been implemented a couple of times already, I trust it will not result in any issues. Again, at this point, totally fine. The protocol had just been merged a couple of days later. It's okay, the merge requests for GNOME still need to be worked on. At this point though, it seemed like it was a solved issue. GNOME was going to lag behind just a little bit, but they'd probably have something done within maybe a month, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, but at some point in the near future, they would also have the protocol implemented as well. Now, over on the GNOME side of the equation, they also had an open issue about VR support. Add VR support under Wayland, opened up by Gabriel Musco. And in this thread, Jonas linked to the implementation he was working on. Now, sadly, people only have a certain amount of free time. Made half the implementation during the holidays, but won't have time short term, so if anyone is interested in helping out, let me know. What should work already is leasable device advertisement, and started the sketch on the request part when suddenly holidays were over. It has only been tested without any actual VR devices. I don't have any, as can be seen in the last commit. Whilst Gabriel admits to just not having the skill or the knowledge to write Mutter code, he does have a VR headset and was willing to go and test the implementation and just see what state it was currently in. Sadly, the implementation at that point didn't build, so doing that testing would require reverting some patches, but again, work in progress code. And people like Sebastian here were actually fully in favor of it at the time, and were even thinking of other use cases for how it could be used. Leasing out displays seems like a good way to allow testing and measuring of displays and scan out pipelines, and was even willing to take over the code after Jonas just didn't have time to work on it. But at the time, it wasn't a core focus of any of the developers involved, so again, like we saw before, the protocol ended up stalling. But this is fine, right? If nobody wants to work on it, the code is just not gonna get implemented. But someone did come along who wanted to go and just try their hand at it and see what was gonna happen. Here we have someone by the name of Hunor? Not sure. But they took the work that Jonas did, rebased it, and then built off of that. So it wasn't a completely new implementation, it was just bringing the previous code, which already worked to some extent, into a slightly better state. Once again though, people only have a certain amount of time in the day and a certain amount of free time, and he also ran out of time to go and implement it, so he closed the MR, but if someone wants to go and pick it up and continue the work, they could absolutely go and do so. Up until this point, absolutely zero complaints with what's happening on GNOME. Yes, it is kind of annoying, the protocol hasn't been merged yet, but it is being worked on. They are trying to implement what was agreed upon in the Wayland discussion. It's just taking a while, and nobody has it as a super high priority. It's the other stuff that started happening where I start getting very critical. When Hunor mentioned he was starting this work, Sebastian said, I do want to mention though that you might want to consider using dbus instead of the Wayland protocol and use portals to access it on the client side. The Wayland protocol doesn't allow for any kind of user interaction before giving clients control. And over here as well, FYI, Jonas and me talked a bit about leasing stuff, and personally I still believe that exposing it via Wayland is not the greatest idea, and an XDG portal would instead be a better fit. Keep in mind, this is 2 whole years after this discussion ended, after every other desktop, every other client agreed DRM leasing Wayland protocol is the way we are going to do this. This was the point to have the discussion about whether you want to do a Wayland protocol or a portal, and it is 4 whole years after the discussion actually started, and no point during the time when the discussion was happening was a portal brought up. It is not until 2 years after every other desktop had started implementing it, and in many cases had already finished the implementations, that portals were mentioned as an option. And Adrian here brings up a good point. The protocol is not GNOME specific. Do you intend your implementation to be compatible with what other compositors are already doing with DRM leasing? I don't care how other compositors/DEs implement their portal backends, they might as well do it with the Wayland protocol like WLR already does for a bunch of other stuff. Not saying it shouldn't be a portal, just would other compositors be on board as well? Would clients, as in, would the applications that need to use DRM leasing? Just make sure you've considered that. If you have, then carry on. And that's the main problem, because yes, you could go ahead and implement the portal if you wanted to, but if SteamVR doesn't want to support it, your solution is now worthless for that. Maybe you'll get support from the open source solutions like Monado, for example, but not having SteamVR is going to cut into a massive reason why the protocol was implemented in the first place. As soon as you make leasing available in another form, xWayland or Wayland, clients can sidestep the portal and any restrictions it puts up. Well, you could just remove the protocol if you want to then swap to the portal in the future. You don't have to keep it there until the end of time. I honestly don't have a problem with forcing clients to implement the portal if they want to work on Mutter. And that's an okay stance to have, right? But you then don't get to complain when clients try to force GNOME to implement the protocol or just don't want to support your broken desktop. Again, totally fair. But it goes both ways. Taking a stand like this made sense 2 years prior when the protocol was still open for discussion. At this point, though, it just leaves GNOME users in a state where the desktop seems broken. It leaves application developers in a state where they would like to work on VR, but the biggest Linux desktop is not supporting VR, so you just can't really justify it in the same sense. And you have users who are reporting bugs to you about GNOME, and you can't do anything to fix them because the support just isn't there. Now, a touch later than this, the DRM leasing situation on GNOME started getting a little bit of external attention. And there was this comment mentioning that Valve now documents using KDE for SteamVR, and also this comment, which got quite a few replies. I'd like to look at rebasing Hunor's work for the latest GNOME 45, but I'm not at all interested in any more this should be a portal or trying to have GNOME stand out from other compositors for a feature like this. Sebastian, this is for you. I don't want to hear anything about this. The protocol has been merged. It's been implemented in other compositors, and this is how it's expected to be done. Trying to debate it now will get you nowhere and will only harm GNOME. And here is that merge request from Dallas, once again being built off of Jonas's work, but now also Hunor's additional work as well, and then some minor patches on top of that. So it was making slowly more progress, but would you be surprised if I told you the same thing happened before, where people have lives, there's only so much time they can spend on something, and whilst there was definitely interest in getting this resolved, there were people in here helping review it, it didn't end up being finished. Now, I can kind of understand why, because there was a lot of stress at the time, and people were kind of sniping back and forth at each other, being very, having some fun with it, we'll say. Fun if you're enjoying it. I can see why you just wouldn't feel like finishing it. Now, when Dallas mentioned doing this work, the first response from Sebastian was, "This should be a portal." I suggest both of you and everyone to abandon this thread. The time to weigh pros and cons of protocol versus portal is precisely now. Let's address it constructively. It was not now. Now was not the time to address it. Again, 2021 was the time to address it. The discussion is over. The protocol is the correct way. The portal is not. Move on. What followed was an absolute hell thread of bike shedding, with people just basically arguing past each other, in many ways just not listening to what the other person is saying, and it really was not productive. Here we have Joshua Ashton involved in Valve also commenting. Whether or not this should be a portal needs a wider than Mutter discussion. SteamVR already supports leasing from Wayland directly using the protocol. I am not going to special case Mutter in SteamVR and bring in a whole bunch of debus nightmare fuel just because Mutter wanted to be different. It is a much better use of mine and anyone else's time to just point to the help article that guides users to use X11 or Plasma that use the standard protocol if they want to use SteamVR on Linux. Mutter also approved the protocol, so what has changed? The GNOME desktop portal would need some way to communicate with the compositor to lease the device directly anyway, so it seems harmless to expose right now. If we collectively decide to move to a portal in the future for XYZ reason, we can do that then, instead of throwing current users under the bus right now. And yes, this comment could absolutely be more civil, but I get it, right? Like, you're 2 years past everything being dealt with, you're at the point where everyone else has already fixed the problem, but there's just one group that decides they want to be special, they want to be different, and they want to ignore what everybody else is doing. And yes, maybe there are advantages of doing the portal, but having the discussion in your repos was just not the place it was going to happen. That needs to be upstream, it needs to have been earlier, it needs to be with other people involved. GNOME cannot make this decision by themselves, otherwise they're not making a decision on anything, because you need clients to support it, otherwise you haven't really made any change. And of course, SteamVR isn't the only consumer of the DRM leasing protocol, but they are certainly the biggest. And GNOME does not have the biggest stick in this situation, Valve does. What followed was a not very productive back and forth between Jonas, Sebastian, and Joshua, but eventually this sort of moved on, and here we have a comment from Jacob of the Monado project. They are the leader of the project, or at least they were at the time and were as of recording this. So they did agree that yes, it would be nice to just move on from this. The protocol has been discussed. The portal needs to be a more wider than just GNOME thing. But they were in favor of, if they do want to support the portal in GNOME, we'll support it in Monado. And that's fair, right? Like, if they want to go and support the solution that GNOME has, that is totally reasonable as well. Now, during this, a portal discussion did actually get opened up upstream, allow for an XR runtime to access needed resources. This is the first thread, but got superseded by the one opened up by Sebastian Wick, Extended Reality XR/VR portal. Now, after a relatively non-productive start of people once again just basically arguing past each other, not listening to what the other person says, and a general misunderstanding of how the architecture involved in doing VR actually functions, there was some useful conversation, like how the architecture actually functions, and if a portal was implemented, what would need to be supported. Ultimately though, after realizing just how much work would be involved in getting a portal done, how much work would be involved in getting people on board with it, how much work would be involved in resolving all of the external issues to make a portal actually possible, he decided that he's going to close the issue. The fact that all VR compositors right now have a client-server architecture means that no Flatpak app has to be able to lease resources from the compositor. It also means that a Wayland protocol is a very bad choice because they are exposed to all Flatpak apps. A dbus service for leasing out resources from compositors such as displays and input devices, there is an MR for LogInD for Hydro devices already, would still be a better design, but they are not regular apps, so a portal is the wrong approach. But a month prior to this happening, there was more health thread discussion. You know damn well this portal would work for you, and you know damn well this is literally a couple of dbus calls that you could implement in an hour, and you already have the abstraction to handle multiple ways of requiring a leasing file descriptor because you support X11 and Wayland protocols for it. I don't care about the dbus dependency. I will admit, full transparency, I don't like the structure of dbus/portal stuff. It's not very clean, and I think this problem can be solved without it. But really, it's whatever at this point. I am tired of arguing on this front. I care about users, and having to tell users, oh sorry, the D you picked is the wrong one, is bad. If me saying, hey, maybe we can compromise, come to some middle ground for now and have a stopgap to avoid that is strong arm us into supporting what you want, then man, I don't know. Implementing the portal isn't harder than implementing the Wayland protocol, and you can add support easily in a day, so why will we put in effort in a stopgap solution? Okay, send me a branch tomorrow. Is this a productive discussion? No. Is it funny? Yes. Now, just a little bit earlier when Sebastian was mentioning a dbus service, this is something he was actually working on. Draft, implement a DRM leasing service. Exposes a dbus service on Mutter to manage DRM leasing. This can be consumed by a portal backend to implement a VR portal, which he also tried to add support in Monado for. Now, the support, as is a common trend right now, didn't get completed, and in the Monado branch, it said, Compositor is missing DRM lease support, and of course, because this was a different approach than what was being supported by Valve, in SteamVR, it would still say DRM leasing is required and is not here. Use something where it works. Now, this is where we were when I originally finished planning this video. However, that was not the end of the story, because we have a new character joining the scene. Blake Batson. Implement the Wayland DRM lease protocol. Blake is not completely new, because going back to Dallas's post, you'll see their name pop up a couple of times. They were doing a bit of testing, trying it out, and I guess just wanted to get this resolved. So this is based off of Sebastian's work, which was on the DRM leasing service, Jonas's work on the original patch set, Hunor's work on the updated patch set, and then Dallas's work on the updated patch set. And do I even need to say it? Again, they ran out of time and didn't get the protocol finished. However, fear not, because now we have our final character, Jose, who also, at this same time, wanted to go and make their own merge request. Now, this merge request, this is the one I showed at the start of the video. Now, when you're cobbling together all of these different patch sets, including Sebastian's work on a dbus service, there is going to be a lot of things that need to be resolved. There's going to be a lot of things that need to be reviewed, and as you're seeing here, Sebastian Wick, he is the one who is primarily doing reviews on this work and primarily trying to get it resolved. Jonas as well, both of whom, earlier as we saw, had been fairly apprehensive in supporting the protocol. When I first saw this going down, I talked about it over on Twitter and Mastodon, and a lot of people said, hey, this is great, but like, don't get your hopes up, it might not happen, this dev isn't like a super frequent contributor in this space, so once again, it might get stalled. But it didn't. It didn't get stalled. They kept working on it, they went through all of the reviews, they got a thanks from Sebastian, and then it got merged. And now it's ready for GNOME 47. Assuming nothing else happens, assuming there isn't something else that comes up, by GNOME 47, VR should work on GNOME Wayland. And finally, Valve can remove this documentation, or at least make a note saying, on older versions of GNOME, you still need to do something else. This is a story of redemption. This went from agreeing to implement the protocol, but just not having something ready, working on it, running out of time, working on it, running out of time, working on it, running out of time. Hey, look, it's 2 years later now. Let's go and do something completely different that we never discussed with the other projects, we never discussed with the clients, and let's just try and do our own thing that nobody else wants to support. You realize that maybe that's not going to be an approach that works, so let's go back to the thing that works, and thankfully, somebody came along who had the time to finish it, and now it's no longer a problem. And now it is one less thing to bring up when we talk about issues that exist on GNOME. I don't want GNOME to lag behind supporting Wayland, because GNOME is, frankly, the biggest Linux desktop, but there are things that should be dealt with that I really want to see happen, and hopefully they get dealt with as well. things like server-side decorations, things like the cursor shape protocol, but at least DRM leasing is no longer one of those things. So let me know down below, are you a GNOME user? Did you want VR to be working? Are you a VR developer and have just been sick of having to deal with this problem? Or do you just not even know what VR is and you have no idea why you watched a video about VR? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, Libero linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me. I don't have high hopes for server-side decorations, but hopefully cursor shape goes a little bit better.